Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and a warm welcome to all our attendees today. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar entitled How BP is Leveraging Technology to Energize Supplier Relationship Management. My name is Ajay Agrawal, founder and CEO at SirionLabs, and I'm your host for today's session. I'm delighted to introduce our experts for us today. Leading off from BP is Jason Donner. Jason is head of IT infrastructure sourcing for BP Worldwide. He is an accomplished procurement professional with more than 20 years of experience in the energy, financial services, and manufacturing sectors. Jason has been head of IT infrastructure sourcing at BP since 2014. And in this role, Jason has led the implementation of Sirion for managing BP's strategic IT suppliers in the hosting, network, and workplace services categories. Joining us from IACCM is Sally Hughes. Sally is one of the most recognized and veteran contract management professionals in the industry. She has been CEO of IACCM since 2015, and in her previous avatars has been both on the buy side and sell side and on the industry and analytics side of commercial contract management. Truly one of the great experts in the world today on this subject, and we're delighted to have her join the webinar.
Thank you, Ajay.
In today's webinar, we are going to be covering insights from Sally and from IACCM on the evolution of relationship management as a key construct within the larger framework of commercial contract management. We will then be also covering the limitations of the traditional and more subjective approach to evaluating and monitoring relationships. Jason will then share with us the inside view of BP's new data-driven approach to monitoring and managing relationships with key suppliers, and in particular, how BP has been driving improved results in those key relationships through a technology or a platform-driven relationship management strategy. We're really pleased to have IACCM as the sponsor for today's webinar. IACCM is the leading organization worldwide for commercial and contract management standards, education, and analytics, and it has helped thousands of organizations and professionals to achieve world-class standards in their commercial contracting processes and skills over the last 2 decades. And SirionLabs as the second sponsor, and SirionLabs' technology is engaged in transforming the way buyers and suppliers engage with each other. Over to you now, Sally, and welcome your introductory remarks on the topic.
Ajay, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Yes, indeed, I've been Chief Operating Officer for IACCM since 2015 and then stepped into the role of CEO just recently. This is an area that IACCM is obviously hugely involved with, and really it's important to look back at history. 25 years ago, businesses were adjusting to a network world. They were installing enterprise resource planning systems, the world of ERP. These changes drove standardization of processes, streamlining communications and data flows, and reducing headcount and costs. But the impact of network systems and standards actually went much further. It started the trend of outsourcing, the rapid breakup of integrated enterprise. It also led to a focus on cost reduction, the era of low-cost supply, and the end of traditional business relationships. So moving on, DJ, please, to the next slide. All of this really increased the importance of contracts and their management. But the problem was that businesses lacked systems to really support inter-enterprise governance and performance. So we see all of these new forms of complexity. There's immense pressure on price continuing across many different industries. A rapid growth of services. The number of business-to-business transactions now that involves services rather than goods has increased exponentially. And we've really recognized that there is simply this lack of skills and systems to manage these inter-enterprise relationships, all of which, as many of you who are familiar with IACCM's research will know, just lead to value leakage. That value leakage can be on average 9.2% of annual revenue. They're really staggering, eye-watering numbers. So moving on, please, DJ, to my final slide. So the key words that demonstrates the needs of business today: simplicity, flow, and speed. At IACCM, we've developed a new concept of RRP, Relationship Resource Planning. And we, as an association, are really excited to see the new technologies and systems like SirionLabs that are enabling and supporting this new requirement, these intelligent systems that streamline supply ecosystems. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Jason.
Thank you, Sally. Okay, well, thank you for allowing me to come and present to you the story of BP's journey around supplier relationship management. If you'd like to go to the next slide, thank you, DJ. Just a little bit of an overview about BP for those who may not be completely familiar with our business. BP is built on its values and behavior. We have 5 core values that we focus on in everything we do. That is respect, excellence, courage, and one team. As an organization, we have a number of different segments, which include our upstream business, which is focused on finding oil and gas. We have the downstream that includes all of our refining and retail. And then we have shipping, trading, and renewable energy. BP has a number of brands you may or may not be familiar with, as well as the BP logo. We also have branding for Amoco, which provides retail stores in the US. We have a brand called AMPM, which delivers convenience stores in the western US states. Castrol, which is one of the world's top motor oil lubricants, and Aral, who provide fuel stations in Germany. We also have a branding Wild Bean Cafe for any of you who are familiar with those coffee shops. A few facts about BP: we operate in 72 countries. There is approximately 74,000 current employees, and our annual revenue of last year was about $183 billion. Next slide. Oh, thank you. Sorry, it's just refreshing here. So as we saw, BP operates in 72 countries around the world, and we have more than 72,000 suppliers, with thousands more supporting them. Each of those suppliers play an important part in our strategy, which integrates our ambition to be a strong, successful business. We have a number of segment-based procurement organizations we call PSCM, each of those supporting the segments we previously mentioned. So whether that's trading, downstream, upstream. In addition, we have a global procurement organization which is focused on the shared products and services. The global procurement organization, which is what I'm part of, covers categories like professional services, HR services, facilities management, and IT products and services. So in my role, I am the head of infrastructure sourcing, and we sit within IT products and services category, which also includes application development and application maintenance, IT products and hardware, software, and then obviously infrastructure. I'm split into 3 separate teams. So I have a team looking after network services. This covers all of the connectivity within BP sites, as well as to all of our external sites, 72 countries, and all of our offshore rigs. We have workplace services. This covers all of the service desk, print management, unified communications, PC as a service, and also field services. And then our last category is platform services, which is all of our data centers, hosting services, and cloud computing, which consists of software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. Next slide. So IT is becoming more and more important to BP, and it is core to supporting our strategy around modernizing BP. So you'll see a big focus from BP on IT, whether it's in cloud computing, automation, data visualization, or artificial intelligence. Traditionally, IT has provided infrastructure support to run applications used to manage financial systems, HR systems, and to support business processes. But now we're seeing use of more of those automation, big data, analytics, robotics, and AI in areas like seismic imaging, well site sensor monitoring, and in a number of safety applications offshore as well. We're currently transforming and building apps in the cloud. You may be familiar with BP.me, which is a new application that we recently launched, which allows you to pay for fuel at the pump without actually getting out of your car. And we're also transforming how it feels to be working at BP. So we're offering a much more consumer-like experience to our employees. Next slide. So complexity of managing strategic services, we just heard what Sally was mentioning about the value leakage that we see in our strategic relationships. And certainly from experience, that's something that we've definitely felt the pain of in the past. And so over the next few slides, I'm going to be talking a little bit about our journey from kind of a baseline of the value leakage we were seeing, as well as talking about the process we went through to implement technology and implement governance in order to ratify that. Coming back to IT infrastructure, which is my area and will be the focus of probably the rest of the slides, we have a number of strategic and managed suppliers providing outsourced services that support those hosting, network, and workplace services. These traditional, I call them traditional outsourced agreements, consist of thousands of pages of legal terms, commercial terms, and service obligations. Without the use of technology, we're pretty much reliant on the knowledge of key individuals, whether that's service delivery managers, contract managers, or IP procurement personnel, to interpret and to keep the supplier accountable to deliver all of the original intent of that contract. Now, as we know, that's not really realistic when you've got multiple outsourced agreements in place. In my experience, these relationships end up focused on probably about 10 to 15 key service levels that are put in place, and then we rely on the supplier's tools and processes to manage and report against those 10 to 15 SLAs. What that means is when disputes arise, it becomes difficult and time-consuming for us to resolve those disputes, and typically they end up in the supplier's favor because our existing data is scattered across multiple systems, multiple tools, and it's just too difficult for us to get access to them. Next slide. So this is kind of a graphical representation about how organizations typically are siloed into their different groups. And without a technology solution, which at BP, this is very common, it's hard for these different silos don't really integrate together. It kind of starts with the procurement. Procurement negotiate a contract with a supplier. Once the contract is complete, that's loaded into some contract management tool like Ariba. Normally a scanned PDF that isn't easily searchable, and then a purchase order is raised in the procurement to pay system, and those typically are two different systems, or they're two different modules of the same system, but they certainly don't necessarily talk to each other or integrate with each other. Our purchase orders typically took the form of a one-line item covering the annual cost of the service. So rather than detailing all the different resource units, it would be a lump sum monthly payment. And then the contract basically would be put into the CLM tool with searchable headers like supplier name, contract owner, the term, the cost, and other pertinent information to the contract, but really becomes a thing of the past. And then the focus is really around delivering those SLAs. If you move on to the supplier delivery managers, they typically own the outsourced service agreement from an operational standpoint. They're focused on managing the supplier to deliver those SLAs and then to ensure operational integrity. They rely on their own ITSM tooling to monitor and record services on things like incident management, problem change, and event management. But the tooling is not set up to understand the complexity of the services that we contracted, and it doesn't really know whether the supplier is delivering to those obligations. It really just understands what's happening at a single point in time. Then with governance, again, from my experience, we see that governance is run using Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoint presentations. We use email to kind of follow up on actions and issues. It's not really collated together, maybe on a SharePoint site somewhere, but we're not really following up on those actions and issues. There's certainly no proactive monitoring of how they're progressing. And then finally, finance are using their ERP tools to process payments. These invoices are typically matched back to the original PO, which was that one line item. And so there's a huge manual process to go through the supplier's pro forma to really understand the number of different resource units and figure out why volumes changed. Did they go up? Did they go down? But inevitably, for us, it ended up being a little bit of a finger in the air, or yeah, that kind of feels about right type of process. Next slide. So given all those silos and that the lack of integrated systems that allow you to proactively manage the supplier's performance and really understand whether you are being charged for the right volumes, you're going to find that value leakage in one form or another. It's going to exist. I've kind of listed out a number of areas that I've had real experience, whether here at BP or at my previous work experience, where, as a vendor management expert, I was able to find value leakage, but each one being very manual process, and you need to be an expert at the contract to be able to pick them out. So if we look at project work for a start, I would say, in my opinion, this is probably the single largest area of value leakage. I can say with utmost certainty that suppliers are very good at knowing the contract and probably better than most of us on the call today. They're incentivized to grow revenue within their account, and so project work is a great way to do that. Since they know the contract better than you, they can be very convincing as to why a BAU task, let's take patching service for example, is considered out of scope because you want the patching to be done at the weekend, or you want it to be done at the evening. Because we don't know enough about what their obligations are, it seems reasonable that doing some overtime in the evening would be a chargeable event. If you have an IMAC mechanism, then again, the supplier is very convincing at explaining to you that a PM is probably required in order for you to deliver a number of IMACs at any one time. So it's another area where you're not paying necessarily for the IMAC, but you may pay a huge amount in project management time. You might also see project spend for innovation or continuous improvements. For example, automating virtual server builds, where the supplier wants you to pay for the hardware and the services, which really just improve their own service delivery and their own performance. So given these conversations are happening within with the service owners who have not read or have access to the contracts, generally these projects are agreed, executed, and paid, and unless somebody is really seeing it on the back end, then that value is never retained or comes back. As far as invoice verification, as I mentioned earlier, this was a very subjective and manual process. So each invoice in any given month would have a number of line items for each of the resource units. We would have finance, we would have vendor managers, we would have service delivery managers. We'd be going through, tons of invoice backup spreadsheets covering, thousands of line items of data to figure out whether the volumes are accurate, or if the right price has been applied to each of the resource units. And then you've got things like, have they applied EPA? Have they used the right currency conversion? Have they applied any service credits that have been due to you? And ultimately, this is going to lead to mistakes and potentially more value leakage. The last area is around service level management. So for those of you using a TPI style mechanism, you'll be familiar with things like continuous improvement, back, expected and minimum performance, all of which need to be managed with a supplier. So if you're relying on the supplier to provide you the data and for them to calculate the performance, then it's harder for you to validate if any concessions are being made in the background. For example, I've seen where the supplier will calculate the performance at, let's say, 89.5% availability on servers, and their service level is 90%. And so they'll reach out to the service owners or to our stakeholders, and through conversations, they'll make a concession and say, yeah, it's like, it's half of a percent. We're pretty close. Are you okay if we go green? And typically, because of the relationships that are held on that level, then those concessions are made, and nobody realizes that actually what they've just given up is equivalent to 3 hours of server outage across the whole estate in a given month. So the point here is that being without technology, managing value leakage is virtually impossible. There's always going to be somewhere and some way of the supplier being able to find that leakage or apply that leakage. So putting technology in place frees up time and effort for all of those arduous tasks in invoice and SLA verification, and allows you to focus more on the relationship, whether that's through the governance or through innovation forums or whatever else that might be. It also creates an ongoing education to the business, because as we define all of the obligations through the contract, and the IT partners have access to the tool, they have better availability to search those contracts and find certain obligations that they can look up. Okay. So what needs to happen, and what tool have we deployed at BP? Well, obviously we've deployed SirionLabs technology, and we use that in 4 main areas of our relationship: contract management, performance management, and finance management. These three modules then feed in to provide what is better, a better relationship management or a better governance structure, that we've got data-driven decisions being made. As I go through each of those quickly, the contract management module gives us a secure and safe place to host our contracts. So when we initiate a contract or a contract change, we put that into the tool. Sirion will pull out all of the obligations from that contract. So they will go through each of the schedules and understand where there may be softer obligations outside the SLA. And together with the supplier, we will assign owners to those obligations. These are then managed through the tool. The supplier is accountable to report against and provide evidence that these are being delivered. And then each month, we're able to see how many obligations have been completed, how many are overdue, and which ones are still sitting with BP for review. We then use this information to feed into the various governance forums and create any particular action issue or escalation. And we'll have a slide later in the deck just to see a sample of what a dashboard looks like in the tool. Performance management is about proactively managing the supplier's SLAs. So we've started to integrate Sirion into the silos we previously discussed. So we have data feeding out of our ITSM tool, as well as our CMDB tool, into the Sirion tool. This gives us the capability to calculate the supplier's performance based on our own data. We're not relying on the supplier, and we use it to validate the supplier's view and ensure that SLA concessions are not being made outside of governance. We also now have the capability to compare SLAs across different suppliers and in different geographical regions. And the financial management is similar to performance management. So again, we pull data in from our CMDB. We obviously have the pricing schedules within the tool themselves, and through that, Sirion have set up the rate calculations so that we're able to predict what the invoice should be, which we use to validate the supplier's pro forma much quicker and much more effectively than we did previously. And then all of this information, as I said, is used to help drive the various governance forums. Where before we put together many presentation packs, we now go straight to the tool. We use the tool to help drive those different governance discussions. Okay, next slide. So this just kind of talks about our approach to relationship management. So I'm going to talk a little bit about supplier segmentation, supplier management, and then go into some of the data points that we get from the tool. So if you want to go to the next slide, DJ. Okay, so the first step is to apply segmentation to our supply base. So we have a number of weighted criteria that we score each of our suppliers against. So the first one being the criticality of the service, which is kind of based on the impact to BP if the service is disrupted. So depending on what service it's supplying, we'll score them, and that receives a particular weight. We have the level of spend, which is based on the previous month's, previous 12-month spend, or if it's a new supplier or a growing supplier, and we feel that actually a forecasted spend would be better, we would adjust that to something that we believe is more realistic based on the future 12 months period. We look at we look at supplier risk. This is the financial assessment of the supplier, so kind of a D&B type approach. The barriers of change, i.e. how easy is it to transition the service to another provider. We look at supplier capability and perceived value. This is kind of a combination of how many services that they provide to us today, but also how many services they potentially could provide to us in the future. And then finally, the ability to influence the supplier. So it's all about how much leverage we might have with that particular supplier. So going to the next slide, once the segmentation is complete, we'll put each of those suppliers into one of four levels: strategic, managed, performance, or transactional. And then we apply a level of governance to the first three levels, and we don't apply any governance to the transactional suppliers. So if you take strategic as the highest level, within that we would have multiple operational reviews. We would look at things like we'd have monthly commercial, monthly financial, monthly digital security, operational type review. So there would be a number of different governance forums in that operational level. Then we would have a monthly management review. This is really rolling up all of those operational reviews into a monthly review for the contract owners or the supplier owners, and then we would also apply a quarterly executive QBR for that supplier as well. As you go down, managed suppliers, we would apply more of a monthly operational with a quarterly management, but we wouldn't apply QBRs. And then for performance, we manage them purely at the operational level. Okay, so if you want to go to the next slide. So here we see how all of this comes together. The tool itself, the circle in the middle, which kind of encapsulates all of the information we have discussed today. So the information is pulled from the conventional silos within your organization, either as a data transfer or through integration into the tool. This information is then shared and used by both the supplier and us, the buyer, and then ultimately this reduces the amount of disputes, tensions, time, and ultimately reduces the overall value leakage seen in these large deals. Next slide. So actually just go to the next slide, DJ, because I'm going to kind of cover some of these on the next one. So here's an example of the supplier dashboard that we talked about earlier. So here you can view the performance across all the suppliers in multiple areas of the relationship. So as an example, we've got 3 suppliers here. We can see how they perform against SLAs, invoice accuracy, obligations delivered on time, actions complete. And then for each of these dashboard events, we can interrogate the data further. So the kind of pie chart underneath, we can click on the issues event, and in this example, we can drill down to the issue status and understand more about why the RAG status is in amber, and it allows us to understand a little bit more about where we need to target communications. So benefits of our integrated approach, we've kind of talked about that as well. So let's just jump down to the next slide. Here we see the value of the improved relationship that contributes to the bottom line. So across all of our services, we've been able to drive down the amount of chargeable projects. We've seen multiple invoice discrepancies. And we've been able to credit back for payments that have been overcharged within the services. And then the last slide, we just focus on the results and the road ahead. So since implementing Sirion, we've seen over 190% return on our investment. As stakeholders have bought into the tool and they're realizing the benefits. We are proactively tracking over 1,200 obligations, which allow us to spend more time on the governance and innovation. And because of this value, we've got line of sight to continue our journey by rolling out a number of additional contracts through 2018. So at this point, I shall hand back to AJ to continue the presentation.
Thank you very much, Jason, for that compelling account of a journey of one of the world's most admired and largest companies as you achieve this key transformation. Really super grateful to you for sharing some of that information and your personal insights. A few words on Sirion. Sirion is a technology platform designed to bring buyers and suppliers closer to each other by leveraging blockchain technology and artificial intelligence in automatically parsing complex unstructured data and using the blockchain to create real-time interactions between buyers and suppliers. As Sally and Jason both have adverted, complex contracting has overtaken simple goods and commodities contracting as a macro trend over the last 20 years. The below stats from the US Bureau of Economics and Analysis and also from Forrester clearly indicate that with more than 58% of enterprise spend focused on services and on complex contracting, the pendulum clearly has shifted in the direction of complex relationships over the last 2 decades. This has significant implications for both buyers and sellers, and a holistic approach to managing these complex contracts has become a critical priority over time. And managing complex contracts is very much like flying a plane. It's a question of keeping an eye on the altimeter, on the velocity, on the direction, and it takes the management of all these elements of flight to keep the plane in the air. Similarly, managing a supplier involves managing not just the contract, but the performance, the risk, the relationship, and the invoices all simultaneously. How are complex contracts managed today? This is a point that Jason made as well earlier by talking about functional silos and technology islands. What we see is both on the buyer side and on the supplier side, there are islands of people working without coordination with each other. And these functional silos have become reinforced over time by each of them acquiring tools that are not talking to the adjacent tools. So what we end up with are fragments of the larger picture which are disconnected from each other. The idea was to leverage artificial intelligence and blockchain technology to connect the dots between these fragments and to create that larger holistic picture and to reduce therefore the value leakage on both the buy and the sell side. Over time, Sirion, by connecting buyers with their complex and key suppliers, has successfully delivered hard savings of almost 10%, adding up to hundreds of millions of dollars of value delivered to its key customers across the globe, including BP. We today have more than 250,000 suppliers on the Sirion network with more than 18 billion of TCV under management and with almost 600,000 of total obligations managed and over 3 billion of invoices validated over time, from which we have achieved hard savings of more than 300 million. The end-to-end platform for Sirion begins the journey with authoring the contract, with managing contracts effectively, using, again, as I said, cognitive technology and artificial intelligence to mine the content inside those contracts, to then reconcile the dynamic performance of the supplier on an ongoing basis, real time, with what was set forth in the contract, and ultimately using predictive invoice auditing to audit the incoming invoices from the suppliers. On the relationship side, which is where our focus has been, the idea behind Sirion's blockchain technology was to take the entire universe of informal interactions between buyers and suppliers and bring them into a centralized platform where they could not only be measured, tracked to closure, but also analyzed over time to see where the cognitive dissonance lay and how better to architect contract to avoid these cognitive dissonance points over time. And then, of course, to add these all up in a risk framework. From a relationship management perspective, we specifically focused on 4 types of informal interactions. The governance forums, which are the more structured of these, which are the various levels of buyer and supplier organizations meeting in a recurring frequency to discuss different types of issues. How can we get both of them together on the same platform? How can these be monitored on mobile apps, on the application itself, and how can that data be stored in mind and analyzed over time? Second, ad hoc issues and action items that arise from time to time, which may or may not be flowing from the contract, but are critical to the progress of that relationship. Flowing from them, claims and disputes as well, organically connecting the contract to these informal things, allowing something that was undone in the contract to become an action item, or if unfinished, to become an issue over time. Monitoring the governance process health over time, and then of course the subjective element, monitoring both the suppliers and internal business stakeholders to see and gather their impressions of the overall relationship and to link it back to the hard data. So as you can see here, this is a snapshot of the various governance forums that can be there between a buyer and its suppliers, and how it's starting to now capture within any given meeting all the relevant details, what was discussed, what were the issues and actions that came out of that meeting, and then ultimately moving forward from there to analyzing the data itself. What is the trend? Is the buyer leading into the relationship? Is the supplier leading into the relationship? Who's attending these meetings? How productive is this forum? Is it just a coffee club, or are they raising lots of issues and actions over time? Are they resolving them quickly? What is the turnaround time? And so on and so forth. So that basically was our approach. It has been extremely warmly received by progressive supplier organizations. BP clearly is one of them. There are a few others on this page from the NHS and from the energy world, Vestas. We have 2 testimonials of clients talking about how this fresh approach has enabled them to come ever so closer to their suppliers. Thank you very much. That's the quick view from SirionLabs. We're now going to open it up for questions, and I will ask my colleague DJ to read out some of the questions that have been coming up from those of you attending the webinar today. And once again, thank you very much for your attendance. We're now going to turn to the questions.
Thank you, Ajay. And we have a few questions lined up here. The first one is for Jason. If you can take this one, Jason. So the question is, what were the key messages, Jason, that you gave to stakeholders, both within BP and within its supplier organizations, to drive adoption of this new approach that you have to relationship management?
Yeah, hi, just as a sound check, can you hear me okay again?
Absolutely, loud and clear, Jason.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for the question. I think there were 2 different approaches we took with our stakeholders within BP and also for the supplier organizations. When the time came that we were looking at the Sirion tooling and we were looking to implement that at BP, IT&S were going through various organizational changes. At the time, as we discussed earlier, we had a number of resources that were involved in the governance structure, both through validating invoices, validating performance, and trying to manage the supplier's obligations. So for us, we were able to use the business case around automating a lot of those activities, which then allowed IT&S and helped IT&S implement their vision and their strategy around the new organization. So we took the opportunity at that point to really help them become more lean within their organization. You know, it wasn't, we probably had a couple of jump starts where, you know, the initial onboarding of those stakeholders was a little bit slow. But actually once they saw the value of the tool, they actually came forward and obviously, as we said earlier, now looking to implement in more and more areas of the business. For the suppliers, we really sold the concept based on their ability to get paid quicker. You know, ultimately, when the pro forma comes in, you've got many people checking through the data. we gave ourselves 15 days for that review process, but very rarely did they get paid, or did we agree the pro forma within that 15-day period. So it was really more about this will help you guys get paid quicker, and also for them to spend less time on putting together governance documents. So again, automating that through the tool, what they were able to kind of reduce some of the effort that they had on their side, putting together all the data. And then the last point, which is really important for me, is the tool isn't about being a new weapon to beat up the supplier. It is about collaboration, and it is more about being informed and sharing the same data and coming to the same results. And we have had scenarios where the tool has identified where the suppliers underbilled us, and so they make mistakes too. And so I think the fact that we're seeing this as more of a tool that benefits us both, we were able to get them all on board without any kind of contractual change or any issues, and it's working very well.
Thank you for that explanation, Jason. We have another question, and this one is probably directed at both Sally and Ajay. So the question is, what would be your advice for organizations which are currently operating in the traditional mode of relationship management, and they're looking to move to this data-driven approach? What would be your advice to such organizations? Sally, would you like to go first?
Yes, of course. Thank you, DJ. Well, I think there's a lot of really interesting data that Jason has shared with us that really needs to be taken on board in the context of this particular question. But I mean, certainly from our perspective, and based on a lot of the research that we've been undertaking over the last 12 months or so, when you're looking to implement technology and transition to this sort of data-driven world, you really need to look at your own internal processes as a first step. One of the statements I heard the other day, which I've recounted on a number of occasions, is process trumps technology, and I think never a truer word has been spoken. So I really think that organizations need to absolutely assess existing processes. And then I was also really delighted to see, Jason, what you've done in the context of segmentation, because it is absolutely right that relationship management is different based on where that relationship will sit on your spectrum of agreements. So undertaking that appropriate segmentation and assessing what relationship management you are going to be implementing with which relationships, with which suppliers is very, very important. And then, as we've just been talking about, this need to ensure appropriate stakeholder engagement. Before you implement technology, you need to make sure that those who are going to be using the technology understand why it's coming in and how they're going to be using it. Again, we've seen numerous failures of technology implementations where that hasn't happened. So I think those would be some of my key thoughts on this. But Ajay, what about you?
Yeah, Sally, excellent thoughts. I would only add one point to the ones that were made by you and by Jason on this topic, and that is that the traditional mode of relationship monitoring is a subjective mode, and it's anecdotal, it's survey-based, it's CSAT-based. In all three of those modes of questioning, you're essentially asking people for their opinion on how things are going, or how a relationship with a supplier is progressing, or how the performance of that supplier is panning out. The newer approach, the data-driven approach, doesn't replace the opinions of people or their views. What it does is that it contrasts them against the hard performance data of that supplier, against the hard data of governance bodies, of issues and actions. If we see a trend, for example, that the supplier is attending these meetings with great regularity, is attending to the issues and actions coming out of those meetings with great regularity, Whereas the informal view is that they did not lean into the relationship or behave as expected. Well, then that's a very interesting contrast finding. And those are the points, as I call them, of cognitive dissonance, where one should maybe lean back and say, it's time to look in the mirror, perhaps. So those are very interesting, I would say, changes in attitude that can be prompted by some of the data that comes out of this kind of approach. But broadly, very much agree with your observation, Sally.
Thank you, Ajay. I'd just like to extend on that question very briefly, if I might, and just ask Jason. We were talking about stakeholder engagement and obviously the need to engage with suppliers for the adoption of this technology. It requires great transparency and honesty, shared data between organizations. Did you have any reservations from suppliers on that requirement for that greater transparency?
Actually, we didn't, Sally. We had, we probably had a couple of scenarios where we used governance, funnily enough, to talk about the tool and the benefits to both parties. But essentially, it's all about how you get to the right answer, whether it's through performance management or financial management, quicker. And I think the less time you end up spending on disputes because you're not quite sure where the data's come from or who's manipulated that data before it's come to either party, the fact that we're all working off a single source of truth or one data set, you've got that same common understanding of the information. So I think it's actually strengthened the relationships in a way that we can then focus on more strategic discussions around, whether it's innovation or new services, and less time on those kind of transactional tasks.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Jason. It is exactly what I was hoping to hear that you say. So thanks very much.
Thank you. We have one more question, and this is probably directed at Jason. So it says, relationship management is generally viewed as a fuzzy concept. So how do you measure the ROI on something like this when you're doing data-driven relationship management?
So I think obviously there's a number of different things, right? So I think obviously cost is one area that we measure based on the amount of project work, the amount of value leakage we see. That's a fundamental area for us is to make sure that we reduce outside of what we would typically expect to spend for the service and close that value leakage down. But outside of that, I think there's a lot of softer benefits, in terms of being able to track all of the obligations within the contract. We have better systems of record. So things like managing our CMS or our CMDB. We don't necessarily have a service level around that, but the supplier is required to maintain the information within the CMDB so that we're able to understand more when it comes to things like security issues where, we've had, whether it's Spectra or some of the other crises we had last year around WannaCry. We know where our servers are. We know what operating system they're running. And so we're able to react to those things a lot quicker. And so I think, with being able to get more value out of the contract because we know more about what the supplier should be delivering. Just generally, I think the operational integrity runs much better. We see less P1s and P2s in our estate because we have good maintenance records. We have good line of sight to end of service life. And then as far as the relationship's concerned, issues. I think AJ talked about it a second ago. Issues and actions are completed on time. We don't have resource time spinning on commercial disputes, which ultimately reduces the amount of resource effort that we can then shift and focus on other relationships. And so, as we said on that last slide I presented, we're seeing a 7 times increase in the number of suppliers that we manage today than what we did 3 years ago. So I think there's a lot of cost being a key factor, but there's a lot of softer benefits that may be somewhat subjective, but certainly we see a lot of return on that investment.
Thank you, Jason.
So this one is for Ajay. And before that, we've received a lot of requests for these slides in the webinar recording. So we will be sending those to all attendees shortly. So don't worry about that. The next question is for Ajay, and this is that when selecting a technology platform for effective relationship management, what are the key features or capabilities that one should keep in mind?
Yeah, I'm not going to make a long list of, it's a great question, but I'm not going to make a long list of functional requirements in selecting a platform of this kind. I mean, I think from my perspective, there are really 3 key elements when distinguishing the previous generation of contract management technologies versus a more futuristic design. The first is that the previous generation of contract management technologies tended to be predominantly back-end softwares for the negotiation and ultimately the storage of contracts. What we're realizing in modern management constructs is that these systems need to connect the buyers with their suppliers after the contract has been signed. So whether it's by leveraging blockchain or it's by leveraging a kind of a permissioned architecture, the system must be capable of allowing the buyer and the supplier to continue interacting with each other after the contract has been signed. That for me is the most fundamental construct. The second is that it must connect the dot. So the problem with the traditional forms of CLM has been that they have tended to operate as technology islands within the enterprise, where the buying takes place on the P2P system, the management takes place on the ERP, the sell happens on the CRM, and the CLM is sitting outside of all of these 3 major technology hubs. So it's very important for the futuristic system to be tightly integrated with the buying cycle, the selling cycle, and then of course the financial cycle, so that the value that's anticipated in these contracts is directly being then correlated to what's being managed in the rest of the enterprise.
Thank you, Ajay. I think we've got time for one last question. And the question is for Ajay, and this is, has SirionLabs set up a blockchain contract management platform for any client? And if so, what was the experience? What has been the experience so far?
Thank you, DJ. Great question. Absolutely. The first point I'll make is the blockchain can be applied in contract management scenario in more than one way. The most obvious application of the blockchain is in smart contracting, in using the blockchain to create a smart version of the contract from day one that can then literally be brought to life by the structured data that's captured in the process of creation. Sirion is not at that stage yet. For the kind of complex contracts that we are handling and the types of data that's involved, it is not possible to have a smart authoring system in place. The simple types of contracts that are there in the universe today, like derivatives contracts, etc., those can be converted into smart contracts virtually immediately, but not these kind of complex outsourcing contracts. So what we do is a very interesting application of the blockchain, which is an after the event blockchain. And in this, what the buyers and suppliers do is sign up for zones of agreement where Sirion will be the common blockchain between them. Those could be service level validation, it could be obligation management, and as in today's topic, it could be issues, actions, and governance bodies which collectively comprise the universe of relationship management. These are all interconnected blockchains which allow both the buyer and the suppliers to reference a common point of data or a permission ledger, which is at the heart of the blockchain. So I hope that answers your question.
All right. I think we are at the end of this session. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this webinar and joining us. We will be sending out the email with the slides and the webinar link. And at the end of this webinar, there'll be a short survey, just 3 or 4 questions. We would really appreciate if you could fill those out and give us your feedback. So
on behalf of SirionLabs and IACCM and BP, thank you very, very much for your time in attending today's webinar. We hope that you guys got some value out of it and look forward to hearing your feedback. As DJ said, the content will be relayed to you shortly.
Thank you and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.